If you're one of the growing number of people running Linux who still needs to join a Microsoft Teams call for work, here's a strange experience you might have run into recently. The meeting works perfectly fine if you open it in Chrome. It works fine in Microsoft's own Edge browser. But open that exact same link in Firefox, on Linux, and things start breaking, until you go digging into your browser settings and manually weaken your own privacy protections just to get the call to load properly. That's not a bug. You're imagining. That's a real documented pattern, and it's the latest example of a service millions of people rely on quietly treating Linux users like second-class citizens. This is the story of how Microsoft slowly pulled Linux support out from under one of its most widely used business tools, and why the browser you choose on Linux still decides whether that tool even works for you at all. Before we get into what's happening now, it's worth being precise about what we mean by locked out, because this isn't the dramatic kind of lockout we've covered on this channel before, where a bootloader flat out refuses to start, or a computer gets told outright that it's no longer supported. This is quieter, and in some ways that makes it more insidious, not less. Nobody at Microsoft sent a notice saying Linux users can no longer access Teams. There's no error message telling you outright that your operating system isn't welcome. Instead, the service simply works worse. Degraded, inconsistent, dependent on browser choice, for one specific slice of its user base, while working exactly as intended for everyone else. That's the kind of lockout that's much easier for a company to avoid ever having to answer for publicly, because there's no single dramatic moment anyone can point to and demand an explanation. Let's start with the part of this story that already happened, because it sets up everything that came after. Microsoft Teams used to have a real, native, standalone application built specifically for Linux. It wasn't a browser tab pretending to be an app. It was an actual dedicated client, installed like any other piece of software, running independently the way the Windows and Mac versions always had. For Linux users working in offices that had standardized on Microsoft's collaboration tools, that native client meant Teams behaved like a first-class citizen on their operating system of choice. Then, in 2022, Microsoft made the call to discontinue it. Going forward, Linux users wouldn't get a real native application anymore. Instead, they'd be pointed toward a progressive web app, essentially a website, dressed up to feel like an installed program, running through whatever browser happened to be on the machine. To be fair, this wasn't framed publicly as some anti-Linux decision specifically. Microsoft's broader Teams strategy has shifted toward web-based and PWA delivery across the board, including for some Windows scenarios too. But the practical effect on Linux was unmistakable. A real, independent application got replaced with something that depends entirely on browser behavior, browser compatibility, and browser support decisions that are, in practice, largely dictated by whichever browser Microsoft is most invested in. The community reaction at the time followed a pattern that should sound familiar by now if you've watched other videos on this channel. Users took to Microsoft's own official Q&A forums asking directly whether the native Linux client was actually gone for good, or whether some kind of proper replacement was still coming. The responses from Microsoft representatives were polite, but non-committal, vague reassurances that updates would arrive in the coming months, without ever committing to restoring feature parity with what had just been taken away. Some users pointed out, reasonably, that if Teams was moving to a PWA model anyway, that at least meant the door stayed open for genuinely equal support across every browser and platform going forward. No native app to maintain separately meant, in theory, no reason for Linux to lag behind Windows anymore. That reasonable hope is exactly what makes what happened next so frustrating, because equal support across every browser is not what actually materialized. And that's exactly where the story gets interesting, because it's just a website now, turned out to mean something very different depending on which browser you happen to be using. Here's what actually started happening once Teams moved to that browser-dependent model. Reports emerged of teams.microsoft.com simply failing to load correctly on Firefox, specifically when running on Linux. Not on Windows, not on Mac, specifically on Linux. The fix that circulated wasn't update Firefox or clear your cache. It was something considerably more uncomfortable. Users had to go into Firefox's privacy settings and deliberately relax the default protections. The same protections Firefox has spent years building its entire reputation around, just to get a basic business tool to function normally. Sit with that for a second, because it's worth unpacking exactly why that detail matters so much. Firefox's default privacy settings on Linux are, if anything, more consistent with what privacy-conscious users actually want than what you get out of the box in Chrome or Edge. Asking someone to weaken those protections isn't a neutral technical fix. It's asking Linux users to trade away part of the reason they might have chosen Firefox in the first place, just to access a service that works without any such compromise in Microsoft's own browser. Whether or not that outcome was deliberately engineered, the end result functions exactly like a soft nudge. Use our browser or accept a worse, less private experience than someone else's. This isn't the first time Microsoft's browser-dependent services have shown this exact pattern either, which is what elevates this from one annoying bug to a recognizable behavior. It's worth pointing out that Microsoft steering people toward its own browser through technical friction, rather than an outright ban, has a long, well-documented history that goes back decades, which is part of why longtime tech observers tend to raise an eyebrow whenever this pattern resurfaces. Back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft was found to have used its dominant position to make Internet Explorer the path of least resistance across Windows, eventually facing a major antitrust case over exactly that kind of behavior. Windows 11 today still nags users who try to set a default browser other than Edge, and for years, clicking certain links inside Windows, search results from the taskbar, links inside Windows widgets, even links inside some of Microsoft's own apps, would force open an Edge regardless of what default browser the user had explicitly chosen. None of that is illegal. The way the 1990s antitrust case eventually determined some of Microsoft's browser bundling practices to be, and regulatory attitudes toward this kind of behavior, have shifted over the decades. But it establishes a clear, repeated pattern. When Microsoft controls both a service and a browser, non-Microsoft browsers have a long track record of ending up with a rougher, more friction-filled experience, whether through deliberate design or simply through priorities that consistently favor Microsoft's own tools. Xbox Cloud Gaming, Microsoft's browser-based game streaming service, has had its own long history of inconsistent support across non-Microsoft browsers on Linux and Chrome OS devices, including on the Steam Deck, where cloud gaming through a browser is one of the more natural ways to access console-exclusive titles. Users have documented having to manipulate browser identification settings just to get the service to recognize their setup as compatible at all, even when the underlying browser was technically capable of running it just fine. Microsoft has, over time, pushed out targeted performance improvements for Linux and Chrome OS browser access to Xbox Cloud Gaming, so it's not accurate to say the company has ignored the issue entirely. But the fact that Linux users have repeatedly needed workarounds, community troubleshooting threads, and manual settings, changes just to reach parity with what Windows and Edge users get automatically, is itself the pattern worth noticing. It's worth being fair to Microsoft here for a moment, because the full picture matters, and jumping straight to deliberate sabotage would be overstating what the evidence actually shows. Building and testing web services against every possible combination of operating system and browser is a genuinely difficult engineering problem. And it's entirely plausible that Microsoft's own internal testing simply prioritizes the combinations. Its own telemetry says are used the most, which, given Windows and Edge's dominant market position, means Linux and Firefox usage patterns get comparatively less testing attention almost by default, without anyone needing to make an explicit decision to disadvantage them. There's a reasonable technical explanation buried in here too, and it deserves mention rather than dismissal. Firefox's privacy-focused defaults, stricter cookie partitioning, more aggressive tracking protection, tighter restrictions on certain web APIs genuinely can interfere with complex real-time web applications like video, conferencing tools, which often need broad access to microphone and camera permissions, WebRTC connections, and background processes to function smoothly. It's not unreasonable, on a purely technical level, that a browser designed around minimizing what websites can access might occasionally clash with a service designed around maximizing what it can access to deliver a smooth video call. That tension exists across plenty of privacy-focused browsers and demanding web applications, not just this one specific case. But here's why. It's just an engineering oversight, doesn't fully explain what's going on, and why this story earns a place on this channel alongside the other patterns we keep documenting. An oversight is something that gets fixed quickly once it's identified and reported. This specific Teams on Firefox on Linux problem isn't a mystery hidden in some obscure corner of Microsoft's codebase. It's been documented, discussed, and reported through Microsoft's own official support channels, including questions posted directly on Microsoft's Q&A platform from confused users trying to figure out why a fully updated browser on a fully updated Linux system couldn't load a basic work meeting without security compromises. When a documented and reported issue persists, rather than getting prioritized for a fix, oversight starts to look a lot more like acceptable collateral damage from the company's perspective. For a user segment it doesn't consider commercially important enough to fully support. And that's really the core insight underneath this entire story. Linux users on the desktop have historically been a small enough slice of Microsoft's overall user base that fully supporting every one of Microsoft's browser-dependent, cloud-connected services on every non-Microsoft browser simply hasn't been treated as a priority worth dedicating engineering resources to. That calculation might have made some sense 5 or 6 years ago when Linux desktop share genuinely was a rounding error, but we've spent several videos on this channel documenting exactly how much that picture has shifted this year. Millions of Windows 10 users migrating away after end of support, government agencies in multiple countries actively moving away from Microsoft's ecosystem, and Linux gaming finally becoming genuinely viable thanks to Steam and Proton. The population of people affected by Teams doesn't quite work right on your setup is growing every month, even as Microsoft's support prioritization for that exact use case doesn't appear to be growing to match it. There's also a slightly uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of this whole situation, and it's worth calling out directly. A huge number of the people switching to Linux right now, especially professionals and IT-savvy early adopters, are precisely the kind of users who still need to stay connected to a Microsoft-centric workplace for their day job, even after moving their personal or primary machine over to Linux. Teams is often not optional for them. It's how their employer runs meetings, shares files and coordinates, projects. Which means the exact population most likely to be newly arriving on Linux is also the population most likely to run headfirst into this specific browser compatibility mess at the worst possible moment, during their first few weeks getting comfortable with an unfamiliar operating system, while also trying to stay functional for work. Think about how this actually plays out for a real IT department managing a mixed environment. More and more companies, especially in software development, data science, and technical fields, have quietly built policies allowing employees to run Linux on their work laptops, precisely because so much modern development tooling assumes a Linux-like environment anyway. Those same companies, in the vast majority of cases, still run their internal communications through Microsoft Teams, because switching an entire organization's meeting and messaging infrastructure is enormously disruptive and expensive to undo once it's in place. That creates exactly the population of user. This story is about technically sophisticated employees, explicitly authorized by their own employer to run Linux, who then discover that the mandatory work communication tool doesn't treat their setup as a fully supported first-class option. It's a strange contradiction, permitted to use Linux by policy, but not fully supported by the tools that policy still requires them to use every single day. And once you're inside that contradiction, the workaround options aren't great. Some IT departments end up quietly recommending a secondary Chromium-based browser installed purely for Teams calls, which defeats a lot of the point of choosing a Linux setup with a specific, deliberately configured browser in the first place. Others simply accept the privacy trade-off as the cost of staying employed, which is a genuinely uncomfortable position for a company to indirectly put its own Linux-using employees in. Let's talk about what the actual workaround situation looks like today, because it's a familiar shape if you've watched this channel before. The community has, once again, done the diagnostic legwork Microsoft's own support channels didn't fully do. Community. Troubleshooting threads walk affected users through the specific Firefox privacy settings that need adjusting, or recommend switching to a Chromium-based browser like Chrome or Brave, specifically for Teams calls, treating it almost like a known limitation to route around rather than a bug anyone expects Microsoft to actually fix. Some users have settled on running Teams exclusively in a separate browser profile dedicated to work tools. Precisely so, their weakened privacy settings stay contained to that one use case instead of bleeding into their everyday browsing. It works. But here's the workaround the community figured out is a very different experience from the service just works the way it's supposed to out of the box. And that gap is exactly what locked out means in the context of this story. Nobody's account got suspended. Nobody's access got explicitly revoked. It's a softer, quieter kind of lockout. The service technically still exists for you, but only if you're willing to either change browsers or weaken the exact protections you may have chosen your browser for in the first place. That distinction between an explicit ban and a soft, friction-based lockout is worth dwelling on for a moment because it's exactly the kind of thing that makes this pattern so hard to hold any single company accountable for. Nobody at Microsoft has to write a memo saying, make this harder for Linux users, for the outcome to look exactly like that in practice. All it takes is a long chain of individually defensible, individually small decisions. Which browser gets the most QA time? Which platform gets prioritized in a sprint planning meeting? Which bug reports get triaged as high priority versus low priority? Consistently landing in the same direction, update after update, year after year. The cumulative result is indistinguishable from an intentional policy, even if no single person ever intended it that way. And from the perspective of the person stuck manually weakening their browser's privacy settings, just to join a work call, The distinction between intentional and an accumulation of deprioritized decisions doesn't really matter. The friction is real either way. It's worth pausing on how differently Microsoft tends to respond when a comparable problem hits Windows users specifically, because the contrast is instructive. When a Windows-specific bug generates enough visible frustration, a bad graphics driver update, a botched feature rollout, anything that starts trending on social media or generating mainstream tech headlines, Microsoft's pattern has generally been to move with real urgency, a public acknowledgement, a timeline for a fix, sometimes an emergency patch pushed out within days. That responsiveness makes sense from a purely business perspective. Windows problems affect the platform Microsoft's entire empire is built on, and bad press about Windows itself threatens the core product line directly. A browser compatibility quirk affecting Linux users running Firefox, by contrast, generates none of that same institutional urgency, because it doesn't threaten anything Microsoft considers core to its business. It shows up in niche tech forums, Linux subreddits, and enthusiast Q&A threads, visible to exactly the community it affects, and essentially invisible everywhere else. There's no mainstream headline risk, no shareholder-facing story, no reason for it to climb any internal priority list the way a genuine Windows crisis would. That's not a conspiracy, it's simply how prioritization works inside any large company operating on limited engineering resources. But it does mean that being a Linux user interacting with Microsoft's ecosystem means accepting implicitly that your problems will always sit several rungs lower on that priority ladder than an equivalent problem affecting Windows itself, no matter how legitimate or well-documented your specific issue happens to be. Every one of these stories, Windows 10 users leaving for Linux after end of support, secure boot certificate transitions, quietly complicating dual boot setups, a 28-year-old free tool getting retired with a paid subscription positioned as the replacement, and now a core business communication tool functioning like a second-tier experience, depending on your browser and operating system, points toward the same underlying dynamic. Microsoft is not going out of its way to announce hostility toward Linux users. There's no public memo declaring Linux support a low priority. But decision after decision across completely different products and teams within the company keeps landing in the same place. Windows and Microsoft's own browser get the smooth, fully tested, fully supported experience, and everything else gets whatever level of support happens to survive the trip through a smaller testing budget and a lower internal priority ranking. What happens next is worth watching closely because the pressure on this specific situation is only going to build from here, not ease off. Every one of the trends we've documented on this channel this year points toward more Linux users needing to interact with Microsoft's ecosystem from the outside, not fewer. More Windows 10 refugees means more people running Linux at home while still working for Microsoft-centric employers. More government migrations in places like Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland mean more public sector Linux users who may still need occasional interoperability with Microsoft run systems during any transition period, and more enterprise IT departments quietly permitting Linux on developer machines means more technically capable employees hitting this exact wall and being vocal about it in public forums, tech communities, and yes, videos exactly like this one. At some point, the sheer volume of documented friction becomes hard for even a company as large as Microsoft to keep treating as a low priority, especially if any of these affected organizations start factoring how well does this actually work for our Linux using staff into future software purchasing decisions. If you're one of the people dealing with this exact Teams on Firefox problem right now, or you found your own workaround that isn't mentioned here, drop it in the comments. It genuinely helps other people hitting the same wall find a fix faster than searching through scattered forum threads. It's worth remembering that this entire pattern across every story we've covered on this channel this year keeps getting solved the exact same way. Not by the company that caused the problem, but by the community it happened to. And if you want to see the full picture of why so many people are ending up in exactly this position in the first place, running Linux, but still tethered to a Microsoft-run workplace, I've got the full breakdown of this year's Windows 10 migration wave linked right here. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing exactly which corners of the Microsoft ecosystem keep quietly treating Linux as an afterthought, because based on the pattern we've documented today, this almost certainly won't be the last one,